Same reason why other names I'm not calling you by your name that I know your name is. But do I know the rest of you guys like in some other way? Because I'm completely fine with anonymity. Just tell me yes, and that'll be fine. I'll be like, okay. Hey, tell me this. All right, Sugar Cow, I believe you. Tell me this. What do you guys think? I published that first audio and video from the Bible versus Middle East that I worked on for a long time. I tried to get the audio, how should I say it, as even as possible without just being, you know, angry the whole time. So I had to record it like 2 or 3 times. So I worked on it for a long time, and I thought I got it, really good. And then it took forever, to get the video, because, even doing slideshows, or maybe especially doing slideshows, because, like, if I had recorded video, that would have taken far less time. It takes a long time, right? So then I publish it. Oh, Hannah, you're on camera. I'll get you off camera. Okay. So anything from that over, you're not on camera.
Okay.
Maybe I should zoom it in, but we got a small place. We live in a camper. I just trimmed my beard. Anyways, so I published that to YouTube and BitChute on the same day, and I've been checking YouTube. I'll get it off this live stream. You know what? I just need to... I can't look at the screen like that. There we go. So anyways, I kept checking both BitChute and YouTube. And right now I have almost twice the views on BitChute of just that one, the latest one, that I do on YouTube. And when you look at like statistics and numbers, it doesn't seem possible in reality at all. So, and the thing is, up until a few years ago, the pandemic years, my subs were steadily increasing a lot for a long time, like for a few years. And then all of a sudden, they topped off. That was it. Over. Oh, I gotta grab some. I forgot I was going to wear my business hat. I just got some hats and shirts printed for the business. That's not the shirt I'm wearing today. That's a good t-shirt. Actually, I think they got probably the best band shirts that you can get with art. Like the best art. Great t-shirts. Like Mastodon. Anyways, that just can't happen in reality. I've got 350 subscribers on BitChute. I have 3,500 subscribers on YouTube. So how I'm getting double sometimes the views on BitChute, in reality, that can't happen. So just weirdness. I guess any of you can figure out what the FYT live stream stands for. So here's an interesting one. I was looking through all the books that I had on language, especially English, but if there's books on like multiple languages, I will check those out too, because I'm always interested in anything on various languages. And bring that back up. I'm going to have to, because I can't see my screen correctly now, because I had to jerk it way out of the way. Okay. I found this one by a guy named George Miller. George A. Miller, since there's probably 1,000 George Millers. And he wrote it, I guess, in 46. They say then it was published in the 50s. But I did check the book. The book actually does say 46. And as I started reading through this, it was really interesting. So first off, it was written as an educational thing. College, I would think, not secondary. But he has basically a note to the educator that's using it, and I think something to the students. But what was really interesting is when we get to like the introduction. So, interestingly, and I'll just go ahead and click on this, which will minimize my camera for now, which is totally fine because now we're focusing on this. This is what I thought was really telling. If what I imagine or theorize is true, English is not per se an organic language that's been around for hundreds of years. It's a relatively new language. And I'm not even 100% whether it was native to England or if it was just a language that was contrived from a number of existing languages. And then, the powers that be just moved forward with it. Makes a lot of sense when you look at all the problems inherent in English. Not just English, but now every language. Because really in the last, we can say 1 to 1.5 centuries, all languages have been either formed or reformed. Now I say formed because a lot of their official stories don't add up at all. So anyways, he starts out, and this is the first thing, when anybody starts out a book on language and communication with a quote from Lewis Carroll, that's telling. When anybody starts out any subject, especially if this person is an establishment figure, like George A. Miller, he's an establishment figure, with a Lewis Carroll quote, for me, that's just red flags. Why? Because I think Lewis Carroll is just loaded with bizarre symbolism. I mean, I could probably do like a reading with commentary over on my Patreon of a Lewis Carroll book, Through the Looking Glass. When you consider the implications of even a poem of his like The Walrus and the Carpenter, which I think was from Through the Looking Glass. Lewis Carroll's got some strange work. And I think it's loaded. It's more loaded. It's more loaded than a Texas Corral baked potato. Loaded stuff. So he begins it with an interaction between Alice and Humpty Dumpty. It's his quote, "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, and I'll blow this up so you see the text is much bigger. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." And he responds, "The question is," said Humpty Dumpty, "which is to be master, that's all." And that's profound. When she says, "Oh, the question, can you make words? Can you make words mean whatever you want? Can you make words?" And this is even better than her saying, "Make words mean whatever you want." She says, "Can you make words mean so many things?" And he's saying, well, that's not the question. The question is, which is to be master? And I believe what he means by that is, which is to be master when I say? Which word is to be master when I say? And who is to be the master of the words that I or anyone else says? And there you have the problem with our language, modern language in a nutshell. Not just English, which is fraught with problems. And most people should be highly aware of all the problems that English has in it. If you've ever watched some of these people that actually dig into linguistic trickery, like the language of law and the language of contracts, things like that. Like what is legal language and what is, regular English, what is legalese, what is gloss, things like that. Yeah, it's fraught with problems. But moreover, it's not just the English language. I mean, I wish it was just the English language that was absolutely fraught with problems. Chris Cheek, the algorithm hides your channel because of your content. Well, I believe that, yeah. It's just that I think that they're also messing with the metrics. I don't know that they're really messing with comments, even though me and a few other creators kind of had a running dialogue with one another regarding comments, and how often comments would be hid. And likes seem to be... There's this idea of, for instance, Google was doing this probably, 10 years ago, easily, where they basically had their browser designed in such a way that they could make the individual viewer, depending on their account, see what they wanted them to see. And that's what my big concern is, of course, is them... Let's say me as a creator, I see one thing. And you as somebody who would be watching might see something completely different. And therein, I think, is that space where they can hide things, change metrics, view counts, likes, things like that. And who's to say they can't? I mean, in fact, if we can believe some of the statements made by some of their former techs, they can kind of do whatever they want and do, according to them, if they're telling us the truth. So I'll go forward with this. The author George A. Miller says, or writes, the object of this book is to summarize for students of psychology. The object is to summarize for students of psychology the results of scientific studies of language and communication. These studies have been made by men of widely differing backgrounds and interests and for diverse and often unrelated purposes. It's interesting that students of psychology, they really need to closely examine language and communication. The reason being is the way psychology was crafted 100 or so years ago by figures like, for instance, Jung and Freud, which anybody who's familiar with a lot of my content knows that I have problems with. For instance, this is a big problem. Jung's idea of archetypes, the way he says that archetypes are how archetypes exist. Basically what he says is we're all born with those archetypes. They're like hidden way in our primordial centers of our brain. And that's why we all respond to certain archetypes, because we're born with them. It's like part of our psychological makeup. It's inherent. Archetypes, as opposed to we're born without archetypes, and they very subtly implant those archetypal figures. With me, when I'm studying any of these things, especially when it's establishment stuff, I'm always thinking, yeah, well, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And from what direction are you trying to sell this to us from? So he goes on to say, communication is so pervasively important in all walks of life that every branch of the social sciences is concerned with it, studies it, and adds to the general fund of knowledge about it. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty correct, right? Communication, you say this and I hear and understand the same thing you said. That's what's so important. Communication breakdown, when somebody says something and the other person reacts and says, don't you dare say that to me. And they're saying, I think you completely misunderstood what I said. And they said, well, how could I misunderstand the words that you're saying? I think you did. Communication breakdown, that's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because we want to have a language, a way of communicating, wherein the source or the sender sends out a message and the receiver picks up or decodes that exact same message. We need a consistency, a redundancy in communication. And if we don't have it, we have a very faulty form of communication. So he goes on to say the beginning student is often overwhelmed by the variety of forms that the study of communication can assume and finds it quite difficult to reconcile one with another or to develop any well-rounded evaluation of the subject as a whole. I can't imagine why that the beginning student is so often, probably always, overwhelmed by the variety of forms that the study of communication can assume, and why they would find it quite difficult to reconcile one with another or to develop any well-rounded evaluation of the subject as a whole. I would say that the majority of students who are not in the know, the intimate know, are going to be radically confused by all of this. It's like they're going to be navigating through a field of, unintelligible, like questions without answers is one of the hardest things for the critically thinking students of anything, whether it's in college or whether you just open up a book one day and now you're a critically thinking student. Questions without answers, questions without acceptable answers. That's what makes it so difficult. He goes on to say he needs an introductory orientation to this heterogeneous field of knowledge. It is this need which the following pages are designed to satisfy, I doubt. The orientation of this book is strongly biased in well, at least he admit it. But I don't think he's going to admit every bias. He said it's strongly biased in two directions. It is scientific and it is psychological. Now, I think he's using biased in a different way because I don't think something that is scientific is biased in a negative way, but he's just telling us that it's aimed towards the scientific and psychological pursuits of language and communication. A scientific study of language, as opposed to a speculative discussion, begins with direct observations of communicating individuals and searches for the relation of these observations to the existing body of scientific knowledge. And, I mean, in general, that's a good thing. You can't fault that, I don't think. He goes on, there exist many speculations of a literary or philosophical nature that are interesting and stimulate the imagination. Unless these speculations lead to scientific observations and generalizations, they are not discussed here. And I will tell you that there is this huge portion in the book, unfortunately, that is just absolutely pregnant with these very long and drawn out ideas of like how the ear hears frequency and all that stuff. And I'm not saying that they're not valuable, just not to what we're doing here. Rejecting opinions in favor of facts helps to reduce this vast topic to manageable proportions. And again, nothing wrong with that. Let's talk facts. Let's talk science. Let's talk concretes. We want concretes. The psychological bias restricts the discussion to the effects of language on the behavior of the individual. Psychology is the science of behavior. Correct. So what are we saying? Like, I would just say this, like just to load this up as we go. If he says that we're mostly focusing on the scientific aspects of language and communications and the psychological aspects of it. Both super important because scientifically, we need to be able to sharpen this up into like unmistakable maxims regarding language and communication. Psychologically is great because whatever statements he makes or whatever he's trying to convince us of, he does make this statement that the psychological bias restricts the discussion to the effects of language on the behavior. The behavior of the individual. Think about that for a minute. What he's saying. Behavior? Well, of course, I'm going to direct this towards the Bible and specifically the Hebrew of the Old Testament and how we understand that. as well as talking about English and other modern languages. But considering that, maybe more than anything else, because I don't think anyone can argue with me, that the Bible has had a more marked, profound effect on the entire world, not just Western civilization. The entire world, since Western civilizations, people of the West, they rule the world. That is objectively true. So no matter if you have Buddhists out there, Islam, Judaism, no matter what religion, though I don't believe that the Bible's a religious book, as hard as they try to make it into a religious book, it has had more of a dominant presence and profound effect on the whole world than any other book. So we're talking about book as the basis of thought, beliefs, and behaviors. And here we get back into that word behavior. Psychology is the science of behavior. And if communication is broken down and people behave based on a broken line of communication, that is remarkably problematic. It's not like a little problematic. Like I've been taking a spoonful of sugar in my tea every day because I thought refined sugar was good for me. I've been doing that for 30 years and now I got cavities and that's bad. I'm going to have to get them fixed. Not one of those things, which isn't good, but it's not the worst. Like one of those things is in the way you behave regarding your life, how you look at death, how you look at others, the value of others, the value of our world, the value of anything and everything. If there's a communication breakdown, things that the sources or the authors wrote in any document, most specifically the Bible, aren't being accurately communicated to us, it is going to profoundly affect our behavior, and not in positive ways. I don't think anybody can argue that there's a positive to misinterpreting a message and behaving as such, because how can that ever be a positive thing? It's always a negative. He continues, our present interest is not in language as one of the social graces, but as a kind of cooperative human behavior. Right. As a cooperative human behavior, because it is really important. You know, language and communication, cooperative human behavior, because we're not here alone. We may all be spending way too much of our time alone or isolated, but we're not here alone. Whatever experience we're having here, it's a group thing. So it's so massively important. He goes on to say, in some respects, the scientific study of communication resembles the task of soaring off the ground with a tug at your own bootstraps. Science is, in one sense of the term, the set of symbols that scientists use to communicate their knowledge to other scientists. These symbols are published in journals and books and tables, and the symbols of one generation are studied by the scientist of the next. A science of communication, like all other science, must consist of such a set of scientific symbols. The peculiar aspect of a science of communication is that its scientific symbols refer to other symbols. It uses language to talk about language, and it is somewhat puzzling that the new symbols about old symbols could clarify the problem in any way. Right. And here's something that we're going to see. Is he gives examples in later chapters, which we'll be looking at, because, I mean, if I don't cover it in this live stream, I'm going to cover it in the next week's live stream. Because there's so many important things to extract from this book and to talk about. Is he uses examples where he has two kinds of language. He has essentially a meta language, is the language that you use to discuss another language. And the thing is, in our context and in the context of this book, the meta language is English. And for the years that I've been looking into the Bible and other topics, that's been the language I've been using. That is the meta language that I'm having to use to talk about anything. It doesn't matter if I'm doing, let's consider the book of Luke, or let's consider the book of Matthew, or if I'm examining anything in Greek or Latin or any other language. It's all going to be through the meta language of English. And one of the biggest problems that I see is that if we have a very big problem, a very real and an easy to demonstrate problem in the way that the Bible's been communicated to us. And we also have a very big problem in even the construction, the form, and the usage of English. You essentially have a very, very bad meta language being used to talk about, to articulate problems in your language of examination. So, yeah, it's kind of a huge, I don't want to call it necessarily a catch-22, but you know where I'm going with that. All right, so let's see here. Give me 1 second. I got to cut my mic for literally maybe 5 to 10 seconds. Sorry about that. Okay, I apologize for that. I had to blow my nose. I don't think you want to hear me blow my nose. So he goes on, the ordinary language of everyday's sociabilities becomes the object discussed in another language of science. It's as if we used microscopes to study microscopes or yardsticks to study yardsticks. Exactly. And he's just re-emphasizing exactly the point that I made. But of course he's doing it in a different context. A similar dilemma confronted the pioneer psychologists who set out to understand the human mind. Really? Their only weapon was the human mind itself. And that is interesting. It really is. On top of itself. Because the thing is, you can't remember, what's the old adage? We know that old saying, poison is like 90-something% protein, right? And it's only a small amount poison. So there's a lot of protein in here. And it is bizarre, right? That if you set out to study the mind, and the tool that you have to study the mind is the mind, it does present a dilemma. They were forced to ask themselves, can the mind comprehend itself? And that's a brilliant dilemma, right? The student of language must ask himself a similar question. Can we advance our knowledge of the use of symbols by the use of symbols? And here's my answer. I'm going to answer it already. And you're going to hear this answer over and over again. I believe you can. But there's a caveat to that. I believe you can. If you have an appropriate set of symbols that have inherent value and meaning, that are so complete in not only in and of themselves as individuals, but in their ability to interact with one another in such a way that there was nothing about this place we live and experiences that we're having that it could not adequately communicate, just given the only variables to this language I'm talking about being adequate, as far as symbols being used to talk about or describe or whatever, symbols. The only thing about that is, are they and do they have the ability to be put together, to be arranged in ways that adequately describe virtually anything that is worthy of being discussed or communicated, let's say. I mean, there's some things that maybe we can't communicate. Don't you think? Isn't it possible that there are some things that can't be communicated? I mean, I'm going to go back to chat, and I'm going to ask that question again. Do you think it? Now, let's say my theory is that there is Potentially. There potentially exists a language that is so inherently valuable. It is so that there is a language that probably exists that is so inherently valuable that you should technically be able to use it, the symbols themselves or a combination thereof, to describe basically anything worth describing in this experience and world that we are sharing. I guess my question would be, are there aspects to this experience that either aren't worth communicating, or there is no ability? Is it possible that there wouldn't be a language or that could be conceived that would be able to describe certain things? Are there certain aspects to this experience that you simply can't communicate no matter what kind of language you have? Now, that isn't central or core to what I'm talking about, but it is a question. I think there are sometimes things that are really hard. Look, if you look in the Bible, there are a number of entries, has to be like a dozen or more of them, where the words, whatever they may be, they're translated or they're rendered as like cries of woe or despair. They're like translated as like eek or oh, or some awful sound that maybe you would call an onomatopoeia. But if those words are even close to being accurate, maybe even cries of woe and pain and despair and displeasure, cries of emotion, are worthy to be adequately communicated. And I hope that if a language exists that is perfectly adequate for means of communication within this experience that we're sharing, that it would have the ability to communicate things like that, just cries of grief and despair and everything else. All right, I'm going to get back to this now. Okay. So there is a little, I'm going to have to minimize this just a little bit. He says, is a science of communication possible? If science is simply if science is simply just a set of tools used to determine the truth or factual nature of anything or everything, maybe, even though I don't think science can adequately measure things necessarily like, emotions, then maybe. Now, he goes on to talk about, well, we'll just do this, I guess. Such a bootstrap undertaking requires a new attitude towards language. To the student who begins the study of verbal behavior for the first time, language is a personal, almost magical thing, bound up inextricably with his private thoughts and feelings and ideas. Well, it is a magical thing, in fact, especially English. Pretty heavy on the sorcery there, maybe. But it is really great, and you'll see that in children as they learn language, how powerful, profound, and effective language actually is and can be, which is why I don't think we should ever take the breakdown of communication lightly. He goes on to say, before he can begin a scientific study of speech and communication, he must learn to take a detached, formal attitude towards it. Obviously, this guy has not been through the sensitivity training, the DEI. In the formal attitude, the personal, meaningful aspects of verbal behavior are often ignored, and the symbols are seen as simple patterns of muscular twitches or agitations of the air molecules or patterns of squiggles on the page. The scientific study of language begins with its formal, impersonal attitude towards these twitches, agitations, and squiggles. And that's in part what he spends a huge amount of this book going into. I mean, stuff that will put you to sleep. If you were on a pound of cocaine, you'd be nodding if you tried to read some of this stuff. The formal attitude towards communication, not that I would know. The formal attitude towards communication is an important first step. A scientist can consider that his own verbal behavior is not under scientific scrutiny. He uses it to talk about the verbal behavior of other people. It is often easier to be objective about what other people are doing than about what we ourselves are doing. A scientist can forget that his friend across the room is saying something. He looks at the movements of the mouth and the face as a kind of artistic dance. He listens to the melody rather than the words. He asks himself, does the pitch glide up or down at the pauses? Does every grouping of sounds follow the same pattern? Does the talker use more verbs than adjectives? Why does he select that particular pattern of symbols instead of some other? What does his speech reveal about him as a speaker? What is his effect upon other listeners? After a little practice, the scientist is able to look at verbal behavior as impersonally as he regards a falling stone or a whirring motor. Then he's ready to begin the formal scientific study of verbal behavior. So we're not going to really spend that much time going into his minutiae of verbal behavior. But I think it's instructive, the underpinning beliefs that he's trying to foist on us about verbal behavior. It's good to know that, because I don't think, if we kind of considered them, I don't think we could find any of it really adding up. So it's good to look into at least a bit of this section, at least a bit of it, and see what he has to say. He says, an interesting theory of the origin of language in the human race holds that speech movements imitate gestures normally made with the arms and head. I find that really interesting. And just like he said, interesting theory of the origin of language holds that speech movements imitate gestures normally made with the arms and head. Why do I think that's interesting? Well, I think that's interesting because, as I've noticed over the years, that not just ASL, because that's become a standard. Before ASL, American Sign Language, there were a number of sign languages that were actually used by various peoples, even speaking the same language. But I'm just going to say sign language, period. That I was of the belief, and I kind of still am, that sign language actually represents to us, I would say it's a great illustration of how communication is possible without all of the distractions that, for instance, English brings to us as part of the form of English, the grammar of English, all of the various terminologies, the ofs, the articles, a's and these, things like that. Because a lot of sign language actually, it has no need for those things. Now you might say, well, yeah, but I mean, in sign language, you're using your eyes and ears. And so you're actually picking up more information than if you were just listening. And that's true, but interestingly enough, if you go back to like the old movie tone reels that Periscope Film has on their website of their newsreels from like the 1920s, 30s. It's harder to find the ones from the 20s, maybe the 30s a little bit, 40s. What you'll find is that the guy that narrating the whole thing, he's not using a lot of the. He's basically he's talking in pidgin, what they call pidgin. Like what you would think like the cartoon of the American Indian, who doesn't use the qualifiers or the construct form like of. it's the castle of the king. He would not use both of those qualifiers. He might just say castle of king, or he might even, depending, reduce that to king castle. Strange as that sounds, because in context, here's a funny thing, even if he wrote that out, in context, you wouldn't need him to provide those things. And there's a lot of aspects to sign language, especially older forms, as best as I've kind of discovered them, where they cut out all of those unnecessary things. So it is interesting that he actually says that. Well, they think that I don't know that I agree with him. It's just interesting the statement that he makes, that he thinks, well, the movements of the mouth or what the mouth does is sort of echoing or trying to emulate what the arms and head, which are actually used if we're one-on-one, person-to-person communicating, the arms and head are used. I use my arms and head all the time when I'm communicating with people. When I do my audios, that's something that you miss, that you're missing right now, that I'm using my arms and my head to communicate. I'm using my arms, my head, my eyes. The shape of my mouth when I articulate certain things. How big my eyes get when I say certain things. I mean, these are all great forms of communication when it's physical, when it's one-to-one. They're fantastic. And I would say that you actually lose something every time you take away an aspect of that. Like every time you put another wall, another filter between what would be one-on-one, face-to-face communication. Like, for instance, what Yahweh says concerning how he communicates with Moses. He says that to Moses' brother and sister. If we can trust the way that that's translated, he literally tells them, I don't speak to him in all kinds of ways with veils, walls, or filters between me and the recipient. I speak to him face to face. It's kind of a big deal. I don't know that he describes his communication with any other person at any other time in that way. And it makes sense, doesn't it? If the law of the Old Testament is supposed to be as important as it seems to be, and I will say, in the context of the Old Testament in particular, the law is the most important centerpiece of that whole thing, all the communication, everything that's going on. It's the most important centerpiece of it. So articulating the law as part of an agreement, not that it didn't exist before. I don't have any reason to think that it just didn't exist, period. But existing as an articulable part of an agreement between two parties, I would say, is what we see beginning in Exodus and being repeated over and over and over and over and over again throughout the entire rest of the Old Testament. So I guess it would be super important that if he spoke to anyone in that close and unmistakable a fashion, it would be to Moses, right? Before anybody else, over and above anyone else. So he goes on to say, suppose, for instance, a primitive man. A primitive man. So are we talking about the first 20 minutes of 2001, A Space Odyssey primitive man? Are we talking about the monkey man? Are we talking about the heavy-browed man that couldn't walk quite upright man? What primitive man are we talking about, Mr. Miller? I don't know. He says, suppose, for instance, a primitive man wanted to make a beckoning gesture, but it was dark, or his hands were full, or his companion was not looking. In this crisis, he got the idea of making a gesture with his tongue at the same time his throat made a noise. So I guess it would be something like, ah. And of course his companion realized, he wants me to come there. Anybody who makes a noise like that, because he said he couldn't see. He's saying the primitive man used his tongue and a noise from his throat to tell him to come here. I don't think it's a good example, but we'll keep following that trail. The friend interpreted the sound as phonation modified by a beckoning tongue movement and came running, presumably. Okay. So if any of you can actually believe that for a second, we're going to have to back way up and talk about some other things. The primitive man who's in the dark with his pal moves his tongue and makes a throat sound. And his primitive pal, he says his primitive pal figures it was a phonation modified by a beckoning tongue movement. And he came running. Naturally. That's exactly how primitive men think. And then he came running and hit him on the head with a bone and ate him. So, he goes on to say, whether or not this theory is correct, we shall probably never know. Oh, I got a good idea of whether or not it's correct. It does serve to illustrate a behavioral approach to the problem of communication. To think of speech as audible movement and comparable to movements of the arms and legs is to think of speech as vocal behavior. Viewed in this way, speech is not essentially different from acts of other types. Its apparent uniqueness rests upon its importance to man, the talking animal. Speech accomplishes the same sort. I have never seen an animal cry. I've never seen an animal, and outside of a Steven Spielberg movie, try to get revenge, hold a grudge, laugh. No, hyenas aren't laughing. So I take great offense to that. Man, the talking animal. Speech accomplishes the same sort of result that other behaviors could, only more expeditiously. And now he's talking about audible, like verbal audible speech. And how do we know that that was the inception of speech? How do we know that the inception, whoever created it and designed it as written and everything proceeding from written? Why do I say that? Well, I say that because audible speech, I mean, unless the person who created it conceived of tape recorders or whatever, written speech is one of the easiest ways. It doesn't matter. You literally have to have some sort of utensil that can scrawl, scratch, write, whatever, and a medium to put it onto. That's all you need. And now that can ostensibly communicate with another party as long as language isn't changed from the source to the receiver. As long as there's no changes made, as long as there's no filters, as long as there's no noise. And it was a perfect language that had inherent meaning and value. It could ostensibly last, say, and mean the same thing forever. So I don't know for sure. I would not tell you that, yes, I'm on his side. I think language was conceived of audibly, verbally, orally first. Or with the tongue and throat sounds that his friend automatically recognized in the dark and came running. I would say that's probably out. So he goes on, many people who have not considered carefully the psychologist's problem have been puzzled that he's reluctant to use mentalistic terms like experience, consciousness, ideas, etc., unless he can relate them to observable behavior. The reason is simple enough. Science is a public affair, but personal experiences are personal. To enter the domain of science, personal experiences must be made accessible, observable, public. Unless the personal experience is reflected by the person's behavior in some public way, it cannot be studied. I think they've really flipped that over the years, to be perfectly honest. If a psychologist wished to study your dreams, for example, I can't imagine what psychologist would ever want to study your dreams and make interpretations of them that meant that for some weird, creepy reason you wanted to have sex with somebody in your family. I don't know. Who would ever want to do that? If a psychologist wished to study your dreams, for example, you'd have to convert them into vocal behavior. Why wouldn't you have to write them down? Then he could study your vocalizations, but he cannot study the dream itself. Well, that's true. One of the psychologist's great methodological difficulties is how he can make the events he wishes to study publicly observable, countable, measurable. It is significant to note that the device most often, isn't that interesting? That even back when he wrote this, which would be the late 40s, the late 1940s, he did not find it necessary to put an and at the end of a string of adjectives or a list. He didn't find it necessary. I don't think it's necessary, but you have to these days. It is significant to note that the device most often used for conversion from private to public is verbal behavior. Thus, speech is a crucial problem for psychology. None of his other activities gives the same sort of insight into another person as does his verbal behavior. His verbal behavior. Do you think that's true? Now, I didn't ask myself this question before, but I'm just saying, do you think it's true that none of the subject's other activities, or any person's other activities, gives the same sort of insight into another person as does his verbal behavior? I don't think that's true. I think just on its face, it's not true. I think his behavior, like cut out the verbal part, just behavior, that's what gives anyone an insight into another person. Their beliefs is their behavior, not just their verbal, but their behavior. If a person goes to work every day and they show up on time, or they show up early and they do a really hard, good day, and they're always honest, and, they don't steal, lie, they don't threaten coworkers, they don't, misbehave, that's their behavior. They don't have to be able to speak. They could be a mute. And you'd know all kinds of stuff about them based on their behavior. You'd know they believe in the value of hard work. They believe in honesty. They believe if they do a good job, they're going to get promoted, get more money, get good things, have a better life. You don't need verbal in that. Their behavior. That's what I measure people's beliefs on. Not what they say. I don't give a crap what they say. Their behavior. That's the problem. Is people say all kinds of things. They say they believe something. They say they are this. They say this is that. But then they behave in a different way. Can we expect that a guy as bright as George A. Miller would really believe that there's no other activity that gives the same sort of insight into another person as their verbal behavior? No, their behavior. That's not true. Seems like he's misleading. Intentionally, because that's a rookie mistake. He goes on and says, since men spend so many of their waking hours generating and responding to words, and since speech is such a typically human mode of adjustment, no general theory of psychology will be adequate if it does not take account of verbal behavior. I'm just not sure if I agree with that either, or just, I could agree with if he said communication, because he's going to get into communication. And the thing is, with communication is not limited to verbal behavior. It's not limited to, verbal speech or codes of verbal speech or anything like that. He goes on to say, this is no simple task. The psychologist has usually found it easier to think clearly about nonverbal behavior Then he has accumulated information about knee jerks, stomach contractions, salivating dogs, etc., and has attempted to bring some order into this mass of behavioral observations. By assuming a formal attitude towards verbal behavior, we hope to be able to treat it within the broad framework of the psychologist's generalizations. Yeah, verbal behavior is fine. It's just an aspect. It's not the end-all, be-all. It's an aspect. I'm going to get into this section a bit on how one thing signifies another, because I've read through so much of this book and gotten bits and pieces out of almost all of these sections that I think so many of them are valuable. He says, begin with some basic, perhaps self-evident concepts. It is natural to distinguish an organism from its environment. We say the organism is designed by evolution to convert food and water into tissues and work and to reproduce. To accomplish these functions, and in an ever-changing world, the state of the organism and the state of the environment must be able to mold and direct an organism's behavior. I don't know about ever-changing world. I think the world is sort of a machine. In the sense of ever-changing, you mean like seasons? See, the profound changes that I've seen taking place from the time Miller wrote this and years before to today do not seem to be organic, natural changes. So I don't know where he's getting at with that. I think that really backs up the idea that, you know, the world is ever-changing because man started out like the first 20 minutes of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And, you know, for sure in 100 years, we're going to be at Star Trek. For sure. Totally, definitely, for sure. It's all nonsensical assumptions. The necessary information is supplied by means of specialized cells called receptors and neurons. Because of these cells, the central nervous system is affected indirectly by the changes going on in and around the organism. Right. So at this point, he is going to get into a lot of the technical and so for that reason, because I don't think it's actually beneficial, I am going to sort of bounce through this a little bit, trying to get some of the better portions of what he's saying, because it becomes very, 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 very evident as he goes what our issues are with communication and the most important documents, communicative documents that we have at our disposal today. He goes on, it's common to begin a discussion of communication by pointing out that words are signs that conveniently replace the objects or ideas they represent. Correct. Very, 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 very correct, or very absolutely close to absolutely correct. He says that words are signs. But the problem is, he says, that conveniently replace the objects or ideas they represent. And there's the problem. That is problem number one. Words are signs. Letters, as we call them, are signs. They should just be called symbols, but we call them letters. Like, for instance, oftentimes I refer to Hebrew or Obri letters as glyphs, but they're symbols. They're symbols. So when he says that words are signs, we'll say signs made up of symbols. The problem is that he says that conveniently replace the objects or ideas they represent. And that's the problem. Is that, you know, if I was the authority like that Humpty Dumpty, if I was the authority like Humpty Dumpty, if I was the Oxford English Dictionary, or I was Merriam-Webster or whatever, and I said that Googaboo was something with four wheels that was propelled in some way, people sat in and they went on flat surfaces to get from one place to another. That's a Googaboo. That's a convenient replacement for what we commonly understand as a car or automobile. And therein is a big problem. This is why I'm saying if a language is made up of symbols that are inherently valuable and that are so easy and universally usable in order to convey the thoughts, intents, and ideas of the source, you don't have to worry about the convenience. It's so convenient. It is so convenient that the word googaboo means car to everybody who says it. Isn't it convenient? In fact, we could actually reduce that down to just goo. That's convenient. I'm so happy about convenience. So he goes on to say, it'd be misleading to imply, however, that this representative character of words distinguishes them sharply from all other stimuli to which we respond. The word chair is clearly not the chair itself, but a symbol for the chair. Correct. Or incorrect, but we have no way of knowing. There's the problem. We have no way of knowing if what he just said right there, the word chair, is clearly not the chair itself, but a symbol for the chair. We have no way of knowing whether or not what he just said is true. Now, if the word chair, made up of the symbols C-H-A-I-R, as we understand them, doesn't actually, those symbols do not add up to this object that was specifically made for human beings to sit upon. If we could prove that those symbols combined in that particular way don't mean that thing that I just articulated in English, then we would know that what he's saying is true. The word chair is clearly not the chair itself. But we have no way of determining whether or not those symbols put together actually do mean that, because we don't know what the symbols C, H, A, I, and R actually mean, or if they have inherent value at all, or the way they relate to one another. So we have no way of judging whether or not the word chair actually does mean the chair itself. But we're going to go along. Well, let's play along. He writes, the word chair is clearly not the chair itself, but a symbol for the chair. Maybe that's true. Similarly, playing along, similarly, the light reflected from the object is not the chair itself. In either, you get it, because like you can't see anything without light and the ways that something reflects light. In either case, the response is made to something that represents the chair. In either case, the response is made to something that represents the chair. The something may be light rays reflected from the chair, or it may be the sound waves arbitrarily associated with the chair, but it is not the chair. Here's what's interesting. He just compared two things that are so radically different from one another that it's noteworthy. He compared an arbitrary language, a language that we have no reason to believe has inherent value. So it's arbitrary. He compared that with a natural phenomenon that will repeat itself essentially in the same way as long as the factors are the same, as long as it's not cloudy, as long as it's not, as long as light can come in the room where the chair is. That light will behave on that chair in the same way all the time. But the thing is, we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that there once existed a language that maybe still exists to some degree, in some form today, that would behave in the same way that those light rays behave? And here's what I'm getting at. If a creator who is infinitely wise, infinitely knowledgeable, and just and good created a language to use to communicate with us and to communicate a vast history and laws and maxims for us to live by, for our benefit, or if we don't, for our lack thereof. Would he not create something, a language, that was perfect and had the potential for perfection, and that it would behave in his world, in his creation, in very similar ways to the ways that his light rays behave on the same object, the chair? And that's the problem that I have with what he's saying here. He's not saying something wrong, he's saying something correct. What I'm saying is there's something wrong with the assumption that there doesn't exist some sort of perfect language with inherent value and meaning that could accomplish that very thing consistently over and over and over and over again. That our problems with languages, the vast amount of languages that there are, the vast amount of subdialects within languages that there are, and the vast problems that there are existing in any given language, especially English, that if the powers that be wanted a world in which we could better communicate with one another, these problems don't need to exist, is what I'm postulating. They don't need to exist. Even if we were using a language that was not the perfect language that the Creator made. I'm saying that whatever language that we use, as inferior as it would be to that perfect language first conceived of by the perfect Creator, that it still doesn't need to be even close to as confusing and problematic as the language of today. He goes on, in short, listeners respond to spoken words in the same way they respond to other energies that impinge upon their receptor organs. As they affect the organ's behavior, stimuli do not present themselves in random, unorganized ways. We do not respond to the chair as if its right arm belonged to the table nearby and the seat were an especially thick portion of the carpet. The chair hangs together as a unit, separated from the table unit beside it and the carpet unit beneath it. It is an important psychological problem to discover the conditions under which stimuli are responded to as stable configurations. The problem is basic to verbal behavior. Without such organization, so it is really important, like what he's saying, not verbal behavior, but language itself and communication itself. It's massively important to the sanity of the people using those languages or communications, to their own sanity, to understand the organization that should exist within that language, because it affects their behavior. If you want people, if you want massive amounts of people to essentially act crazy, like insane and I don't know, stupid or inept or whatever else, just give them a language that can't make sense. And then restrict their ability to change that, to alter it, to question it, to reconstruct it, to redefine it. And then there will be no question towards me of why would we have such a confusing language? Because men seek to control. Men seek power. That's why. And language and the aspects of language and the control of language is power. If you have the power of how people can communicate, by fiat, this is our language. English is the lingua franca. And you have to operate within those rules. And every person who goes to high school, elementary school, every person who goes to college, to graduate school, you have to work within the parameters of these tools of language that we have dictated by fiat that you must use, even though they oftentimes break their own rules when it suits them. But still, you have imprisoned this huge population of people, you have imprisoned them within a language that may not make much sense and may not help them make sense of the world around them and the common experience that we're all sharing. While you, sitting in your ivory tower, know exactly how to communicate with one another. You know exactly what's going on, and you know exactly the kind of tools that you have to impose upon others to keep them imprisoned within behaviors that are dictated by a faulty language, is the point. So he goes on to say these remarks, which hold for stimuli in general, also apply to the verbal stimuli that affect us. Words do not present themselves in random, unorganized ways. Sentences hold together as units, and the component parts complement and modify one another according to their patterning. Sometimes. Words are not distinguished from other stimuli on the basis of configuration, for we impose organization on all the stimuli to which we respond. Now, one more time. Words are not distinguished from other stimuli on the basis of configuration, for we impose organization on all the stimuli to which we respond. And I got to tell you, I'm not sure exactly what he's getting at with that sentence, other than I think he's trying to say that there is some kind of a sense between the experience and the things within the experience, the stimuli around us, and the language which we use to articulate such things, which again, I would oppose that as being true. Words cannot be distinguished from other stimuli on the basis of their representative role or their organization into patterns. I'm not sure that's true either, to be honest, as we go on. What then is the distinguishing mark of a verbal stimulus? The principal distinction is that words have an arbitrary significance. Correct. Then now I would say, yeah, correct. Okay, there is the resolution to the problems that he's been presenting us. Statements he's making that I don't particularly agree with. Then we get to this, and it is agreeable. When he writes the principal distinction between words and other stimulus, whatever, is that words, as we have them today, as they've been dictated to us today, the only thing we know of today. The English language is the only language that I am familiar with in a very intimate way, because I was taught it from the time I was a baby growing up. That doesn't mean I don't know or understand certain portions of other languages. That means I have the most intimate knowledge of it. And it was imposed upon me. English was imposed upon me, my person, my being, my mind, and therefore my behavior. So one more time, he says the principal distinction is that words have an arbitrary significance. Absolutely correct. And I'm assuming everybody is very familiar with the word arbitrary. They have an arbitrary significance. That is so unfortunate, I can't even put it into words. How unfortunate it is that the words that we have available to us in the language, just like he said, in the sentences and the other forms of organization, it's all arbitrary. That's the problem. Is like in nature, and this is probably why so many children out there, I'm sure any of you with children or who have spent time with children, especially children first learning their, 3 R's and all that, know that almost every child out there will at once and easily catch on to the foundations of math where they will absolutely not catch on to the foundations of reading and writing and spelling. Everyone that I've ever known struggle with that. Why? Because math, it's always the same until you start getting into those abstract maths, which I believe that what that is you're now encountering at like the college level, very abstract and difficult maths with all the symbols and languages in and of themselves. Now you're starting to get into an actual language that they have, once again, applied veils to. And that's what becomes the problem, is the veils they start applying to those things. But math in general, it's the same thing over and over again, guy. If you add 5 and 5 of anything, you've got 10. If you multiply 5 times of anything, you got 25. And if you divide 5 into 25 of anything, you've got 5, because it goes in 5 times. Math is always over and over and over and over, and it's not arbitrary until you start getting into those screwy parts of math that I think a lot of people who have critical thinking skills say, I don't agree with the way that this is presented. I don't agree with this as an actual science because it's so flaky. And it's based on so many theories. It's become arbitrary. When math becomes arbitrary, it ceases to be a science. It ceases to be something that, you can do over and over and over and over and over again. And that's our problem with the languages that we're given, is this arbitrariness. He says, he writes, words signify only what we have learned that they signify. And that's the unfortunate thing, is I can't prove that that sentence is true or false, but I have to believe that what he's saying there, it is true, because I have no way of proving that those symbols, when put together into signs or words and then put together into phrases, sentences, or clauses, whatever, statements, have inherent meaning. Words signify only what we have learned that they signify. So whatever the establishment has decided to teach us, that whatever thing, phenomenon, thought, concept, or otherwise is, that's what we're stuck with believing it is. I can't tell you how egregious I find that to be. I find it to be most egregious, and I find it to be anything but accidental. The idea that anyone would theorize or just outright tell us that something like that was either organic or accidental must certainly be a deception. It must certainly be a deception. He goes on to say the fact that we say chair and not Stuhl is a matter of social coincidence. It just depends on whether you was born in Germany or whether you was born in England or maybe America or maybe certain parts of Canada maybe or maybe some other places maybe. It's a matter of social coincidence. In contrast, the association between the light rays reflected from a chair and the chair itself is not arbitrary but universal. That's right. That is radically, absolutely, without a doubt, correct. In contrast, the association between the light rays reflected from the chair and the chair itself is not arbitrary. It's universal. So what I'm saying is, don't you think the same creator who was just, we're not going to get into the loving thing, just, who is just and all-knowing, very wise, super smart, would have the ability, and not just the ability, but the character, the nature, to not only make the phenomenon in this place where we are act the same way, like every time the light hits the chair and the light behave the same way. He would have the ability and the just character and nature to create a language which is so vitally important for our behavior. Which means that when you think of behavior, the Old Testament is full of you're behaving this way and that's not good. I gave you things by way of verbal and or written communication which tell you to behave in another way. That he would not be just if he was punishing someone for behaving a certain way if they were not adequately communicated that way to behave. So where they couldn't come back and say, but it was all arbitrary words and now we speak different arbitrary words. And so we don't know how we're supposed to behave. Because he could come back and say, well, it's not arbitrary. I gave you a perfect language. I communicated with you in a perfect way with a perfect language, and you perfectly well know exactly how you're supposed to behave based on that language that I created with inherent value and meaning. So no, you can't justify your behavior because when he wrote that down, we all spoke Pig Latin, and since then we all took a vote, and we decided instead to speak Morse code. Sorry. It's not the way it works, or it's not the way it should work, not in a just experience, a just reality, a just world with a just creator who communicated. You can't have things arbitrary like that. You would think, based on all that evidence, you would think that if he created the phenomenon in this world to behave in a consistent way, and he has, that he would also create one of the most vital and important tools that we have to communicate with one another that acted in just such a way as maybe the light rays act on the chair or anything else. There's my problem. There, I think, is the problem, not just my problem, it's the problem. He goes on, stimuli that are arbitrarily associated with objects are usually called symbols. And of course, there again, I kind of have a problem. What's my problem? Well, my problem is that he's defining symbols. He is defining symbols here as stimuli that are arbitrarily associated with objects. First off, I don't think it's anywhere near complete. And secondly, the symbols don't need to be stimuli that are arbitrarily associated. They could be symbols because we all have to agree that symbols exist. In every single language that exists, that language is made up of symbols. A lot of people call them alphabets. That is the complete set of symbols that make up the language at their most base rudimentary form. Most people call them alphabets. The problem here, they don't need to be arbitrary, and we don't have to believe that they are. Based on all the other evidence that we have of this place, this experience, we don't need to believe that the symbols in every language that has existed since the beginning of this experience, the beginning of time, we could say, have been arbitrary, or that there has been an arbitrary association, and not just to objects, but also to concepts. Not just objects, but also to concepts. I mean, for instance, the Old Testament Bible Hebrew oberi, it has words in there for love, well, at least that are translated love, translated laugh, hate, things like that. So, objects, concepts, they don't need to be arbitrary. I don't think they need to be arbitrary at all. Look, if you was making up a language and you was super smart and super wise, and you decided in the course of of inventing, contriving, conceiving this language, that you would have a symbol that always meant up. And in your creation that you were making, you had really just certain laws of physics that were going to universally apply, having to do with things like density and buoyancy, weight, lack of weight. And so therefore, up would always be the same darn thing. Up would have nothing to do with what way you were facing or pointing. If you were laying down facing the ground or laying down facing the sky, it would have nothing to do with that. It would have everything to do with above, either whether it's subjective to the object or just objective, something moving upward. And you came up with a symbol that symbolized, I know I'm being redundant, that concept of moving upward. And whether or not it was subjective or objective would depend on the context, the word it was found in, and the context that word was found in too. You could do that objectively. It doesn't have to be arbitrary. I am here to tell you it does not have to be arbitrary. And that he's introducing these ideas so that we would accept that it is. Language is. It's just arbitrary. The symbols, the sounds that they make, the organization, it's arbitrary. It's just that learned people have put all this together. They have codified it. And we've all agreed that those codifications are good enough. And so we proceed forward. That's what he wants us to believe. I'm simply telling you that does not need to be. It's not the only way. He's trying to convince us that that's the only way. That's reality, baby. That's it. Done. Enough said. And I'm here to tell you that if we just look at all the clues, the evidence of this creation, and if there is a creator, what he must be like based on the creation, based on rules, like just simple physical rules of this creation, we can determine that language, which is so vitally important to our experience, that there must be at least the potential for a language existing that is just as consistent as all the phenomena and stimuli around us is. This is the whole point. He's trying to convince us that language is only a sort of a representation, and it's pretty much just whoever says that we've agreed upon, just kind of like money, right? Nothing makes a dollar, or even, and I am going to say this, a piece of gold or silver necessarily inherently valuable. They all have a certain inherent value, like a dollar, a piece of paper. I could write you a note on it. And that would make it inherently valuable if the note said something really important. It's inherently valuable as a piece of paper. Well, it is valuable in the sense of like economic exchange because there has to be an agreement there. And that's what it's all based on. Money and currency and all that exchange, it's based on an agreement. And all his arbitrary language and the rules of all this arbitrary language and everything, that's also based on an agreement. And that's it. But that's problematic is what I'm saying. I'm going to open up the chat and see what's been going on here a little bit. So let me take a look here. Still getting used to okay. So what do we got? Well, somebody said something funny. As per Thief on the Cross. I'm just going to look a little bit at what's been said since I started reading from that just to see what I see. I'm not sure what a tenet of NLP is. Sugar cow. The meaning of a communication is what the listener understands. Yes and no. If what the source meant to say or convey is exactly what the listener or the receiver understands, if there is absolutely no breakdown between those two things, then yes. Of course, the problem that comes into all of this is exactly what Miller is talking about, and that is the arbitrary nature of every single language we have, and most specifically the lingua franca, English. Yeah, artfully vague communication can be used on purpose as a technology or technique of influence, and it is. It is. I mean, all you have to do is look at a number of social media platforms and their community guidelines that are loaded full of artfully vague communication. And they use that artfully vague communication, that it's artfully vague, in order to oftentimes impose sanctions on people. And this has been happening for years and years now. The two NLP books are called The Structure of Magic. NLP. Of course, I'm not going to know what NLP is. Structure of Magic, Volume 1 and 2. Thief on the Cross, heard something funny. Then Hannah says these fundamental problems with language are problems no one else is addressing. And why is that? And that's true. Why is no one else addressing that? Because they are so profoundly relevant to every single aspect of our lives. And when I say profoundly relevant, I don't mean, again, like I said, when you thought refined sugar was good for you, and then you found out through the cavities, weight gain, and other health problems that it wasn't, that's a problem. And the thing is, we can't count the number of people out there who are addressing that. We can't even count. We can't keep track of them all. There's so many people. But for some reason, when Miller makes very true statements like our behavior is dictated by what we believe, and what we believe is dictated by the communication tools that we have. As he admits, all of it being arbitrary. All of it being arbitrary. And so why isn't there this huge amount of people out there that are pointing that out? Like, hey, this is a real problem. My goodness, It's kind of funny that sometimes there have been very few works of pop culture that have pointed out the fine line between insanity and just not agreeing with the rules and restrictions of communication, language, what words are supposed to be and supposed to mean. Kind of weird. There should be way more people talking about these problems, and not just problems in general, like with English or any other language, but these problems as they relate to the Bible. Because as I said, it doesn't matter what somebody's opinion on the Bible is. I mean, that's really secondary or tertiary. What matters is the fact that it, before and over and beyond any other book or way of thinking, philosophy, you name it, whatever, communication device, has more of a profound effect on more people than any other one, period. I don't care what they want to tell you about Islam and its effects on people, of Buddhism, and how many people adhere to that. We have very strong evidence that they have been lying, first off, about the populations in these other countries that they say are adherents to Islam or adherents to Buddhism or Taoism or whatever else. If no one's seen, by the way, I posted that video in the Telegram group. It's a relatively short video where the guy in the video, he demonstrates just how easily they have artificially inflated the numbers of the populations of countries like India and China specifically, but a number of others. And how impossible it is that those countries actually have those populations. So if all these other countries, which are not North America and or Europe, have those populations, those gigantic populations, well, actually, if they don't, and if they're lying to us, and if they're selling us a dream like that there's so many adherents to Islam, and therefore it's such a viable and strong world religion, but those places that they say are heavily Islamic don't have the population numbers they say they have, then they're lying. And it's still the Bible and adherents to the Bible that have the overwhelming influence on the world, hands down. I think they've been using a lot of these lies, statistical lies, population and demographic lies, to get us to behave in certain ways that maybe we shouldn't be behaving in. Thief on the cross, maybe because the structure of the language itself prevents being able to clearly formulate thoughts about it directly. I think it does. I think it goes back to just the idea he brought up of, can the mind study the mind? Which I think it's actually it's kind of a question based on, maybe a question based on certain assumptions that we shouldn't assume. You know, for one thing, that the mind really is what he says it is when he uses the symbols MIND in conjunction with one another to refer to this whatever apparatus it is that we use to think, or to take in information, to assess that information, digest that information, to relay information, maybe. Like a code preventing reflection. Maybe. Oh, neuro-linguistic programming. NLP. Thank you. Neuro-linguistic programming. So that's the thing. I'm going to just check this one more time. There is a couple of other points that he makes, so I'm going to continue real quickly to just to hit a few of these other points in this first section of his, and then I'm going to wrap it. But let's talk about this. He goes on to say, the first encounter with a foreign language usually leaves the student surprised at the perversity of the foreigners. I guess he's going to have to flesh that out. Why would anybody use an improbable name like Pferd, P-F-E-R-D, for something that is clearly a horse? Why on earth? Well, I don't know too many people who say that. I mean, there are other languages that are bizarre in their grammars and their syntaxes and in their terminology. I get that. So, oh my gosh, how perverse. They use a word like preferred for something that is clearly a horse. That's silly. The arbitrariness of names is usually easier to accept, however, than the arbitrariness of grammatical structure. Kind of. Because then you start getting into something that's far more complex and difficult to deal with, especially if it's arbitrary. Why would anybody wait till the end of a sentence to give the verbs? Exactly. Why? Why would they wait till the end of the sentence to get a verb? And here we're getting, of course, into syntax. And that is when we can start looking at the Bible and say things like, why on earth would the same author use varying syntaxes? That does not make sense. It doesn't make sense. And like right now, I was actually in Joel, as they want to tell us. This is the the really interesting part too here. When we get to something like this, where we see Uiamr Eger. Now, Eger is supposed to be this Mitzri woman that was given to Abram, that he ends up having sex with, and has this first son of his, Ishmael, right? What I find is funny is they're unwilling in all these other instances when we see Uiamr to translate that Y before Amr as he. They only use it when there's not a subject after Amr. But when we get to something like Uiamr Eger, we have a problem because Amr or Eamr is supposed to be masculine, and that is followed directly by Eger, which is supposed to be feminine. This presents a problem in the sense that having the Y there on Amr can't be masculine if it's followed by this subject, Eger, which is feminine. Now, they change that into saying that somebody is speaking to Eger, as opposed to the fact that this Y is not necessarily denoting a masculine voice. And now we do start getting into verses where they do start changing up the syntaxes kind of a lot. Because again, then we have now, this is a little bit more appropriate in the next verse when it says Uiamr ele. So that's supposed to be la tu her. Uiamr le. Okay, so that's what we should have saw in the verse before. Uiamr le Eger, or Malak to Eger. There's a radical changing always of these syntaxes and the grammars as you go in the Bible. Anybody who tells you that the syntax or the grammar is consistent in the Bible is lying, because it's not. It's absolutely not. Oftentimes they will keep it similar in very small ways, like for instance just changing the subject and the verb relationship in a couple of words most of the time, but they don't do it all of the time. Now, the examples I just gave you are partially grammar and partially syntax, but we certainly can spend a lot of time getting into the profound syntactical problems within the Bible. They're there. On top of the terminological problems, the problems with terminology that I've spent a lot of time shining a light on in the past. As he goes on to say, it's hard to abandon the feeling that the unfamiliar is absurd and illogical. I'm not sure that that's true either. I'm not sure that he isn't just implanting that. But anyways, it is part of the formal attitude towards language to see that one name or one grammatical rule can be just as good as another. I'm not sure that that's true either. Because I don't think that necessarily, when he says it's part of the formal attitude, so us people who are educated and proper and good people, we'll definitely recognize that one name or one grammatical rule can be just as good as another. And I'm not sure that that's true whatsoever. And I don't think that they think that either, per se. And a lot of them actually don't. He goes on and says the important thing is that everyone agrees to the name or rule, whatever it is. That's the important thing. It's just like money. If you agree that gold and silver is inherently valuable, there you go. It is. If you and another person agrees that a piece of paper with, I can't even say a dead guy, maybe, with an image on it, is valuable. There you go. It doesn't make it inherently valuable. It's valuable for the means of exchange, like the one commenter said. I mean, if whatever the source meant to say is received by the destination, and it's absolutely true, and there's no noise, there's nothing lost, there's no filters, then that was a meaningful communication in a way. But in another way, it wasn't. It wasn't a completely meaningful communication because neither side can prove that those symbols and those groupings of symbols actually have any inherent value to them. They can't agree. They can't determine whether those things, whatever words they use, the pig is fat, actually mean what those sounds have imposed, like what the establishment has imposed upon them that those sounds are supposed to mean. That the pictures that they bring up into their head when they say pig, okay, I have this animal that goes on 4 feet. It's oftentimes pink, not a lot of hair, squeals, this, that, and the other. But you don't know that necessarily those symbols that make up that word that we've all had forced upon us have any inherent meaning to them whatsoever. I would say that breeds, at least, it sets a ground, it establishes a foundation for at least a degree of potential insanity in the people that are forced to use that language without any definable or provable inherent value and meaning to it. He goes on to say, once a society has adopted a set of symbols and rules for combining them, the conventions are no longer arbitrary. That's not true. It is not true. That is a logical fallacy. It is a bandwagon fallacy. For him to say just because a society has adopted a set of symbols and rules for combining them, the conventions are no longer arbitrary, to claim that they're no longer arbitrary because a society has agreed to them, that is the bandwagon fallacy. That is not true. He goes on to write, if everyone agrees to call a horse, of course, then we are no longer free to call horses by any symbol that occurs to us. That's dark. Now, what he first said is not true, and he's passing off a logical fallacy as a fact. But what he goes on to say after that is dark, ominous, foreboding, cruel. If everyone agrees to call that thing that we call a horse, he should say, if everyone agrees to call that living being, that animal that we currently call a horse, then we are no longer free to call those things that we call horses by any symbol that occurs to us. We're no longer free to call it anything else. That's what he means. So it doesn't matter. He says it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to have meaning. It doesn't matter. Look, we basically agreed to it. It doesn't really have to have meaning. I mean, even though language is massively important, as he goes on to argue before this and after this, it doesn't matter. It's just noises. Just sounds. That's all. And if we've just agreed that this is this, then it's okay. Well, it's okay maybe if we're talking about like building a shed. And we have a whole language to that, which involves measurements and concepts, ways and means, things like that, then yeah, we can definitely build a shed from a set of plans if we have an understanding of all of those symbols, like basically the way that the architect or whoever has indicated. We understand all those symbols to indicate these things, but we don't know that those symbols actually tell us a damned thing about these things. It doesn't tell us anything about the wood. It doesn't tell us anything about the nails, fasteners. It doesn't tell us anything about necessarily the design or why the design or anything like that. It basically just tells us enough, just enough, so that the receiver, if he's literate, can read whatever the instructions are and build that shed. Well, that's just fantastic. But that's a prison because we can't really know beyond that, based on the words and an understanding of those words and the symbols, what these things really are, why they function the way that they do. We're limited. That's the problem. We're radically limited. Everything is because we said so. because we've all agreed upon this thing, so of course you need to jump on the bandwagon with the rest of us and just go along, even if you're completely in the dark about everything surrounding basically just those lines of communication. Doesn't matter. We've agreed to it. You call that thing a horse. You're not free to call it anything else. I don't care. So he just, and goes on to say the arbitrary decision was made centuries ago. That's not provable. The arbitrary decision that's based on their story was made centuries ago, and many people abide by it. Bandwagon fallacy again. The point is that how do we know that arbitrary decision wasn't made by a bunch of crazy people? They're crazy. Those crazy people decided that that thing is called a horse. They were crazy people that had speech impediments, that thought that wagging their tongue in the dark and making throat noises would tell their friend to come here. Those people, calling that a horse. You got to go along with it. Jump on the bandwagon. The point is that other decisions might have been made. They may have been made, and that's what makes it arbitrary. But now it's not arbitrary because we've agreed on it. Don't you know? Can't you see? We have said that we must study behavior, that verbalization is a special and important kind of behavior. That behavior must be guided by stimulation, and that the association between stimulation and action may be quite arbitrary. A general introduction would not be complete, however, if it did not stress the importance of order, of pattern, in verbal behavior. Speech sounds, he's so focused on the verbal behavior and not the symbols per se. He's so focused on the sounds. And I would say that if a perfect creator created a perfect language that was inherently meaningful and valuable, that the symbols that he made and the sounds that they were associated with those things, and even the way that the mouth was shaped and the breath was used and everything, all spoke to this consistency of meaning and inherent value of that language. Speech sounds do not occur in isolated bits. They are interwoven in elaborate designs. It is instructive to imagine a language that makes no use of the pattern of its individual sounds. Ach might stand for how do you do, and I for please help me, and so on. There would be very few things such a language could talk about, for men can make and distinguish less than 100 different speech sounds. If we produce only some 50 different sounds and we want to use them and talk about millions of different things, we must use combinations of sounds. If, for example, we use all the possible pairs of 50 sounds, we can make 2,500 different statements. If 2,500 statements are not enough, we can go on to use patterns of 3 or 4 or even 1,000 sounds. There are many more patterns of sounds than there are individual sounds. Now, I would come up behind this and say, well, yeah, sure, I guess. If you have like an arbitrary agreement on a meaning of different sounds, or you just come up with ooh, ah, ee, oh. Now, that means take your starship to Iowa. Okay. I mean, but the thing is, like, how many of these arbitrary combinations of sounds do you have to come up with in an arbitrary language in order to convey something? Whereas if you had a language that had this inherent meaning and value, you might not have to come up with nearly that amount of combinations in order to say things that were far, far, far more meaningful and sensible. Why does he keep wanting to try to justify arbitrary languages? I mean, yeah, it's rhetorical, and I would think most people listening up to this point would get why. But still the question has to be asked. He goes on, a language is of little value if its elements cannot be arranged and rearranged in a variety of sequences, if they're meaningful, and if all of those symbols, when combined in certain ways, have very logical, consistent, inherent meanings, then okay. We must know, for example, how a child learns the word bear and the word eats. But we must also study how the child learns to distinguish the bear eats from eats the bear, from bear the eats. To step on a man's toe and then to apologize is not the same as to apologize first and then step on his toe. The order of events is often more significant than the events themselves. We get into syntax and meaningful combinations of symbols, is what's going on here. And what I believe he's saying is that, again, it's just fine for language to be arbitrary as long as we, as a bandwagon. Of course, we can't see the drivers of the bandwagon. We can't see the rule makers of where you have to sit and how you have to behave on that bandwagon. But they're there. The rules exist. Somebody made it up at some time, and you just need to follow suit and shut up. He says, as soon as we begin to consider all the possible patterns of speech elements, we discover that the vast majority of these possible patterns is never used. Some patterns sound too much alike. Some patterns are too hard to pronounce. Some are prohibited by grammar or by common sense. Our choice of symbol sequences for the purpose of communication is restricted by rules. Yeah, sort of. The job is to discover what the rules are and what advantages or disadvantages they create. I guess at the time that he wrote this in the 1940s, 50s, that all of the problems with English weren't extant, which of course they were, many of them. Not as many as that are extant today, because the problem is, and while he does get into this, though I don't know that he straight out admits it, so figure if he's writing this in the late 40s, we're looking at something that happened, we'll say 80 years ago. The problem is that, for one thing, like, let's just, because he does mention later on, and I'm stopping here for the day. I'll pick up again in where he goes on, like the idealized communication system, which is really, really interesting stuff next time. But that's the thing, is, what he's talking about is, how can I put this? He is talking in a context where actually language had been, or had not been, as reduced or fooled around with, even at that time, as it has been today. The Oxford English Dictionary, which he mentions, likely had an enormous amount of words that were better used and more meaningful than what the Oxford English Dictionary even of today has. It's funny that if we had problems with the English language 80 years ago, that the officials that exist, and they're not like nameless people. Like, if he wants to say, yeah, these things happen arbitrarily, like, hundreds of years ago, and it's just that a lot of people, and, who are you? You're not smarter or more important than all these people, made these decisions hundreds of years ago. If they agreed that all this was fine, then, the least that we can do is to not be an a-hole, and we'll just agree with using the language the way that they did hundreds of years ago, so there. Now, he might be able to say that 80 years ago, and part of his plot armor would be that these were things that were happening in the long-distant past, and, agreements were made based on arbitrary sounds in the long-distance past, and, we've all decided to jump on the bandwagon and use everything in this certain way, and so there. And again, of course, nameless, faceless kind of people that brought about all of these things. The problem, it's not nameless, faceless people since the 1940s that have reduced the amount of words that we have and have actually made English, just English alone, a far more difficult language than it really has to be, simply by those reductions. Those weren't nameless, faceless people that did it. So I have to believe, based on decisions that have been made about just the English language in just 80 years, that the authorities in charge of language and communication aren't trying to make it better. They're not trying to make it better. Now, he does go into things like basic English, And they, even those principles that he talks about with that, which is exactly what they accomplished over 80 years, is making English a lot more basic. Because you got to remember, when he's writing this is when they're enacting all of these free trade crap. It's just because it's complete crap. Everything about it. Yeah, they've just made English harder. They haven't made it easier. There's nothing easier about it. It's just harder. So, hey, look. With that, I'm just going to check a few things in the chat. Of course, this is, this should pop right up on YouTube. I didn't hit record on the OBS because I was already having enough trouble there, but I don't think that really matters. I think that he's brought up like a lot of really good ideas. Of course, he's spinning them one way. And I think that we need to be able to see other sides to those arguments, which is why I'm bringing that up and talking about that. And that's what I'm going to do next week, too. I'll be jumping on about the same time, 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and talking about this problem that we have, this inherent problem with language and communication, if it's arbitrary, and of course the double entente that we have as a problem if we're looking at the communication of the authors of specifically the Old Testament from then to us, when you essentially have this one language and then you have another language that comes along and goes right on top of it in the form of the Masorah and all the graphemes that they use to change parts of speech, to change terms, to separate it all, like one word into many different words. And the things that he brings up, we'll talk about that too. I kind of want to put this in front of my screen so you don't keep seeing what I'm doing and then you see that as an echo. But anyways, there you have it. Some really interesting things written by George A. Miller in his 1946, I want to say they said it was published in the early 50s, Language and Communication. And unless Archive has, in the time that they were down, archive.com was down for a few weeks, unless they've removed a massive amount of content, which who's saying that they didn't, you might still be able to get that PDF for Language and Communication there. So, real interesting book. The stuff that he brings up, even if you're into like the technical aspects of, how the ear works and how the mouth works and how sound reaches the ear and things like that, which he goes into, which I'm not sure that they're all that appropriate to our discussion here, but it's in there. You could check that out. So, and thanks for joining me, everybody, and I'll be back at it next week. If this is an interesting discussion that you'd like others to know about, tell them to hop in. I'm going to try to make it at right around 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time sharpish, every week, ostensibly. So I'll wrap it up. And thanks, guys. See you next time. And please, if you want to support me, go to my Patreon, become a subscriber. I release audios pretty much every week. Sometimes it's a couple a week because it's trying to average out to the 4 a month. Right now, going between, let's consider the book of Daniel and continuing in the rise and fall of the great powers. So it's always interesting stuff. And right now, those two audios tend to complement one another too. So that's one of the best things you can do. Outside a number of other things that you could do to help. And again, appreciate it. And I will see you guys like face to face, kind of, in a week. And now all I got to do is figure out how to stop the live stream. There we go. See ya.